Welcome to the Pleasuredome. Two Tribes was a monster hit and convinced ZTT to extend our option and record an album. This was going to be difficult as we were being dragged all over Europe promoting both singles on TV, and to have a block period set aside to do the recording was impossible with things moving so fast at home and abroad. The lads were back in the Columbia for a while, and we were enjoying the late night bar and hanging out with other musicians. It was the Rock and Roll Hotel of London, and you could hang out at the bar without being a resident. The small bar was run by a diminutive Spaniard called Francesco with the full-on Manuel accent. His accent caused a little confusion for Holly on one occasion. He had come in late one night and asked Francesco to mix him a cocktail, and he was presented with a rusty nail, a mix of scotch and drambuie. Holly tasted it and liked it and asked the barman what it was called. Francesco told him, "It's a rusty nail." There'd be a couple of occasions when we'd be eating out on a European jaunt and Holly would want to appear a little sophisticated and ask the waiter for a rastinel and be greeted with a confused look. Great example of lost in translation. We met loads of bands while staying there. The Revillos were regulars and fellow Scousers Cook the Books and Janice Long would stay there, but the most memorable for me was meeting and having a brief chat with Nico. I loved the Velvet Underground, and to be sitting at a table with the woman who sang All Tomorrow's Parties was a thrill. I don't know what she was doing there, though. It was during this short residency that we met Ian Goddard. He managed a band called The Promise, and he'd always be hanging out there, and we became good friends with him. He'd come and pick us up in the car and take us round some nice pubs in Hampstead and St John's Wood, and would often meet up with us in the Hippodrome. Peter Stringfellow had refurbished the building that was formerly the talk of the town, and only weeks into its opening in 1983 we did a PA there to promote Relax. After the show we were given red celebrity membership cards, even though we were down the wrong end of the charts at the time and nowhere near being celebrities. This meant we had free entry, and it wasn't just restricted to ourselves. Anyone who was with us would get in free also. There were many times we'd turn up with a bunch of scruffy mates who were on a weekend away from Liverpool and just march to the front of the queue past the lines of people outside. We spent almost every night for the best part of a year going there. It wasn't long before we knew some of the barmen and they'd supply us with free drinks, or at least buy one, get two free, so the Scotch and Lemos were getting battered. If we weren't in the Hippodrome, we were round the corner at Stringfellows, although you did have to be a bit better dressed to get in there. I remember turning up one night with Ped and Stringfellow was standing on the door. He knew who we were by this time because he'd see us nearly every other night. He took one look at Ped and said, "I can't let you in looking like that fella. You look like a bloody gardener. You'll have to go round the other place." We met the Wham boys for the first time in the Hippodrome. Andrew had a big plaster across his nose and George told us that some girl had smacked him in the face with an ice bucket. We'd learned later that it was actually the result of a nose job. They were both really lovely guys, and George would appear later on stage with us during our first London shows. The cost of staying at the Columbia was proven to be too expensive, so it was decided that the lads should get a place together. We moved into a 3-bedroom flat in the exclusive Maida Vale. We lived in number 19 of the very grand sounding St Mary's Mansions on St Mary's Terrace, just off the Prince Regent's Canal. The lads' gaff was born. We had a bedroom each in a large through lounge, one half house on the TV and hi-fi, and the other end had a couple of bits of recording gear. It was like the young ones, but with nice carpets and higher rent. It cost us £180 a week, which was quite a lot of money for that time, but we were living in one of the nicest parts of London. We lived there for about a year and had some good times. I guess this is the point where I should give you some stories from the lads' gaff. First up would be a tale about the caretaker. He was a Cockney geezer who lived in the basement and was in charge of looking after the many flats and common passages of the building. We became friendly with him and he'd often pop up and have a beer in the evening if we were at home. I can't remember his name, but maybe it's best that I don't in light of what I'm about to tell you. He was a nice fella and was always trying to impress us with tales that made him out to be some sort of wide boy or borderline villain. One night he shows up and tells us he's got a shooter downstairs. Apparently it had been used on a job and he was looking after it for a friend. We tell him to prove it and bring it upstairs, and he initially declines, but after 20 minutes of Ped badgering him and saying, "Fuck off, you talking shite, you ain't got a shooter, if you've got one, prove it, go ahead, go and get it." So he eventually gives in and disappears downstairs to return minutes later with the sawn-off shotgun, and judging by the masking tape that was wrapped around the barrel, to avoid dabs apparently, it certainly looked like it could have been used on a job. It wasn't for shooting pheasant, that's for sure. We go into the kitchen to look at it in a better light and we all get to hold the shooter. Mark's swinging it round like Dick Turpin and pointing it at various items in the kitchen, including at one point my bollocks, and asks if it's loaded. Caretaker says no, so Mark pulls the trigger whilst pointing it towards the window. Have you ever heard a shotgun go off in a kitchen? Bang! There's a hole in the window frame about the size of a golf ball. The gun was loaded with salt pellets because I think if it had been lead shot then the whole fucking window would have been blown out from that range. We shit bricks. Caretaker grabs the gun and runs downstairs, and we turn the lights off and all jump into bed like naughty schoolboys on a sleepover. None of us could sleep for the ringing in our ears. I could live with the temporary ringing and was just thankful that Mark hadn't pulled the trigger moments earlier when he was pointing it at me nuts. The lesson learnt: don't fuck with guns. We had 3 very posh girls living next door to us, and we noticed one day that they had cannabis plants growing on their window balcony. They were all very well spoken and not the sort you'd suspect to be taking drugs, let alone growing them. They'd often invite us over when they had parties and we got on well with them. They had several cannabis plants and they gave one to us. It'd sit in the middle of the lounge and I'd pluck leaves from it, dried them under the grill and smoked them. It wasn't very potent, but it was free and within arm's reach, so it would suffice. One day the 3 of us were leaving the house to go to a rehearsal room, and before I got in the cab I sprinted up the road to post a card to Claire in the postbox 50 yards away. I'm running because the other 2 are waiting and we're running late anyway. As I'm running back to the taxi, a police car comes around the corner and clocks me. I get stopped and they ask me what I'm doing in the road. I tell them I live here, and one of them says to me, "You're a bit of a scruff, you don't look well dressed enough to live around here." Cheeky fuckers. They walk me up to the taxi where the other 2 are and we're all questioned. They ask us to prove which flat is ours, so Ped takes them upstairs. As he's going up, he remembers there's a dope plant right in the middle of the lounge. If the coppers came in, they couldn't fail to see it. He acts really quickly. He puts the key in the door and opens it slightly and turns to the coppers and says, "There you go, I've proved this is where I live." The coppers want to have a look around, but Ped refuses to let them in unless they have a warrant. Immediately the coppers start giving it, "You got something to hide, son? We can easily go and get a warrant and be back here within the hour to turn this place upside down." Ped says he has nothing to hide but just doesn't want them in the flat. Ped stood and the coppers backed down. We all leave and head to rehearsals, but in the taxi on the way we're beginning to panic because we can see "Pop Stars Busted" and "Frankie Goes to Pentonville" in the headlines the next day. What if they go and get a warrant? What if they come back while we're rehearsing and kick the door down? We can't move the plant out the house because they might be staking us out. Knowing what I know now about the overstretched resources of the police, I know these fears were completely unfounded, but back then we were shitting it. We dropped Mark off at the studio and Ped and I returned to the flat. We run in and grab any traces of torn Rizzlers and joint butts and flush them down the toilet, as we were too paranoid to put them in the bin. But what are we going to do with the plant? That's going to have to go down the bog as well. It was about 3 feet tall and took about 20 flushes to get the various bits of plant and soil down into the London sewers. It was pretty heartbreaking, but it had to be done. We had another brush with the law that was much more amusing. We were down at Sam West recording Pleasuredome, and there were 2 girls who did the catering at the studio that we used to have a bit of banter with. One of them had an old beat-up Datsun Cherry, and one day she left her keys on the counter in the kitchen, and we decided a little car theft prank would be in order. Ped was the only one who could drive at that time, so we took the keys and got in the wreck and drove off for a jaunt around our new manor. We're on our way back and waiting at a junction with Kilburn High Road, and as we approach it in a queue of traffic, a copper walks across the road in front of us, looks at us, and then gestures for us to pull over. The tax disc was out of date. "Are you aware your tax disc is out of date, sir?" "No." "Is this your car, sir?" "No." "Whose car is it, sir?" It's Carol's. Carol who, sir? Don't know. Does she know you're driving it, sir? No. What's her address, sir? Don't know. Is there anything you do know, sir? He radios in to check the details of the car, and while he's waiting for a reply, we explain that the girl works at the studio where we're recording our album, and we've just taken her car as a bit of a prank. He asks the name of our band, and we tell him just as the radio crackles to deliver the car's details. Just as the voice on the other end is about to confirm our story about the car's ownership, the copper interrupts him. Hold on, Sarge. I've got 3 members of Frankie Goes to Hollywood here. He tells us how much he enjoyed our music and told us to take the car back to its owner and tell her to update her tax. A potentially embarrassing situation swerved by our newly found fame. Anyway, back to the lad's gaff. Bob Marley or Pink Floyd was always on the turntable, and Mad Max, The Evil Dead and The Wall were always in the video machine. Video hire shops were opening up all over the place about then, and we'd visit one on the Edgware Road. We'd go in and browse the latest releases and place them on the counter, and Ped would always place a copy of one of the volumes of Electric Blue, followed by the comment, "You've got to have a bit of Electric Blue for the lad's gaff." The Electric Blue series were pretty tame striptease videos, and despite knowing exactly what he was getting, he would always voice his disgust later by declaring them fucking shite 3 minutes into viewing. I told him he needed to get something from under the counter, and told him to ask the guy for something a bit stronger next time he dropped the Electric Blue Volume 74 in front of him. Ped was hugely amused by this expression, and he probably wasn't that arsed about getting some hardcore porn, but had to try it out. The only problem was the guy running the shop could have been my dad or his dad. He was in his late 40s and didn't look like the kind of guy to have something stronger, but I assured Ped that all these guys were in the market for a bit of porno for their select customers. We go down the shop and get a couple of films, and Ped plonks an Electric Blue on top as usual, and out of the corner of his mouth he says, have you got anything stronger? The man's looking at the computer screen to log our rentals, and without looking at Ped, he reaches under the counter and gives him a plain VHS box in a brown paper bag and says, "You didn't get that from me." We get outside the shop and Ped is creasing up laughing and is just muttering, "Something a bit stronger," over and over to himself in between cracking up. As I mentioned before, he did have a twisted sense of humour. Every visit, he'd say the same thing over and over to the guy behind the counter, and I swear that would give him more amusement than any of the content that could be found on the illicit tapes. After one night in the Hippodrome, we ended up with Captain Sensible back at our gaff. He was out on the town with legendary Irish DJ BP Fallon, and we had spent most of the night chatting with the pair of them and invited them back. BP declined, but the already well-oiled captain was well up for extending the party back at our place. We had a very small, narrow balcony that ran the length of the flat below the windows. It was more like a window box than a balcony, and when we get home, the captain insists on climbing out of one window and crawling along the balcony ledge before climbing into the other. We discouraged him, but he's not having it and climbs out onto the ledge. I can see the headlines, and despite being gassed myself, I'm more than a little worried that the captain won't make it, and we'd be on the news the next day explaining how he had plummeted to his death 4 floors below. Luckily, the mad bastard makes it, and we locked the windows and I had the key to avoid any attempt of a return journey. We knew our partying was getting out of hand when a chauffeur ended up living on our couch. Having had 2 number 1s, we were becoming old hands at Top of the Pops, and had notched up quite a few appearances due to the lengthy stay of 2 tribes at the top of the hit parade. We'd get picked up from the flat by a chauffeur-driven Mercedes limousine, and we eventually got to know the driver, Martin, very well. He introduced me to a guy who was a coke dealer on Kilburn High Road, and I'd sometimes shoot down to see him for some bugle, but I think Martin introduced me because he knew I'd slip him a couple of stripes if I had some. He'd turn up at the flat when he wasn't working, but he still had the limo, and he would ferry us about the West End in it and go to the odd gig now and then. It seemed like we were seeing a lot of him, and I was doing a lot of bugle, but not really to the point that I was an addict or anything. I couldn't afford it for starters. Somehow he ended up asking if he could kip on the sofa for a couple of nights because his wife had slung him out. Probably due to the fact that he was spending loads of time with us and getting off his nut and returning home in the early hours. One night he turned up with the dealer, and they had what seemed like a chemistry set with them. This is what is required if you want to freebase cocaine. I'd never heard of this before, but was game and got involved. It seemed an awful lot of trouble to go through when you could just snort it, and it would be the only time I ever tried it. I didn't see the attraction and felt like shit the next day. I was gloomy and depressed, and I guess watching Pink Floyd's The Wall twice whilst being out of it the night before didn't help either. I thought I was part of the machine, but did not connect my low moods with the drug intake from the previous night. So Martin's established on the sofa, but a couple of nights turn into a couple of weeks, and although he's no trouble, we need to get rid of him, so I draw the short straw, literally, and give him his marching orders. He was cool about it, and we didn't see much of him after that because our TV appearances would occur more in Europe over the coming months, and between that and nights working in the studio, we lost touch. A memorable TV show during this time was at the BBC and was hosted by Bob Monkhouse. It was a special one-off show called Bob Monkhouse Meets Joan Rivers, and apparently we were the guests on the show at Joan's request. Before transmission, Ped and I are sitting in one of the many makeup rooms, and two girls who are applying the slap are talking to a third woman in the corner. As we're sitting there, Mark bursts in after having his makeup applied in the adjacent room. "You'll never guess what I've just heard. Bob Monkhouse gets his bald patch painted in with blackboard paint." We turn and are about to question him further, but before we can speak, the third woman in the room pipes up. "Before you embarrass yourself any further, I think I should introduce myself. I'm Mrs. Monkhouse." We do the show, and it's evident that Bob has heard about us taking the piss out of his Dulux pate and is very cold towards us. Joan Rivers was quite the opposite. She was really friendly and invited us out that night to see her perform an unannounced show at Pizza on the Park, where she'd be trying out new material. George Michael came along with us that night, and we sat and listened to Joan do her act. I hope she never kissed her mother with that potty mouth. We did a sort of homecoming TV show when we returned to Liverpool to do New Brighton Rock for ITV. It was recorded in an open-air swimming pool in New Brighton on the Wirral and featured the cream of the current musical crop. We were on home soil and we went down the best despite the array of pop talent on show. It was like doing a gig because it wasn't the usual semi-sterile location of a TV studio where the playback was too quiet. It had to be turned up loud so we could hear it above the screaming. This was the first time we'd experienced teenage girls screaming at us. I wore a really smart Anthony Price military-looking suit that I bought a few weeks earlier for an appearance at the Oxford Roadshow. I'd seen Robert Palmer wearing the same suit at a concert in Liverpool the year before, and when I described it to Paul, he knew exactly what it was and directed me to the Anthony Price shop in South Molton Street in London's West End. I went to the shop and tried it on and thought I looked nuts, so headed from there to ZTT to pick up a cheque to pay for it. I returned to the shop and handed over the cheque for 500 quid. I remember when I handed it over thinking to myself that a year ago this would have been over a month's wages, and here I was about to blow it on a suit. But when I saw how sharp I looked on TV wearing it, I thought it was money well spent. Oh yeah, we're supposed to be recording an album, aren't we? We were spending some days in the studio and also took the opportunity of working the graveyard shift. Trevor and the team were camped upstairs in Studio 1, and we'd work through the night in Studio 2. We thought that we were using what is called downtime and would go into the studio after a client had finished. We thought this would be free to us, and to be honest, we never really thought about the cost until it had become apparent some time later that we were still being charged a full £1,000 a day rate, even though the studio had earned its money that day. We'd start about 8 or 9 in the evening and work through until the morning. We had Stuart Bruce as our engineer, and we recorded a load of the first album whilst doing the night shift. I remember the backing tracks for Born to Run, Crisco Kisses and the Ballad of 32 being recorded during these night sessions. Although Stuart was the engineer, we were in charge and ran the sessions as we were becoming more experienced in the studio. It was great to have the run of the creative playground, and I definitely benefited from not having Trevor peering at me intimidatingly over his specs. The album was coming along nicely, but we were interrupted again to go on another foreign trip. Frankie were going to Hollywood, and it wasn't to do a gig. We were going to be in the movies.